Silence should never feel this loud inside a family home. In one of Brentwood's quiet, tree-lined streets, where privacy is protected by hedges and security cameras and mornings usually unfold without interruption, something went terribly wrong. It was not a scream or a sudden alarm that first raised concern, but the absence of routine. Phone calls went unanswered. Appointments were missed. Two people who were always reachable simply vanished from the rhythm of the day. When authorities finally entered the house, the calm exterior collapsed into a scene that would shock even a city long accustomed to tragedy. Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were dead, and within hours, the story took a turn few could comprehend. The announcement from prosecutors was blunt and devastating. Charges would be filed against their son, Nick Reiner. 2 counts of first-degree murder, with special circumstances for multiple victims. A legal statement delivered in measured language, yet carrying a weight that rippled instantly across Hollywood and beyond. A son accused of killing his own parents. It is the kind of sentence the mind resists, searching for a mistake, a misunderstanding, anything that might make it less real. But the facts, as they were being presented, left little room for denial. For the public, the shock was magnified by who the victims were. Rob Reiner was more than a successful filmmaker. He was a cultural figure whose work celebrated connection, love, humor, and the fragile beauty of human relationships. His films had comforted audiences for decades, often centered on family, forgiveness, and emotional honesty. Michelle Singer Reiner, though far less visible, was widely described as the steady force behind the scenes, the organizer, the protector, the emotional anchor of the household. Together, they represented something rare in Hollywood: longevity, stability, and an image of parents who never stopped trying to help their children. That image shattered almost instantly. As details began to emerge, the narrative grew darker and more complex. Reports spoke of a violent death involving a bladed weapon. Investigators suggested the attack had been personal, intense, and prolonged. Yet even as these fragments circulated, authorities were careful to emphasize what was not known. No official motive had been confirmed. Key forensic results had not been released. What remained was a void filled by speculation, fear, and disbelief. In analysis segments, such as those led by Jesse Weber, the focus shifted from headlines to context. Not to excuse, and not to accuse beyond the scope of the charges, but to understand. Who is Nick Reiner beyond the label of suspect? What kind of life leads a person to stand accused of the unthinkable? And how does a family, even one with immense resources and public admiration, reach such a catastrophic breaking point? The early timeline only deepened the unease. The bodies were discovered hours after death, suggesting a long window where nothing appeared outwardly wrong. Nick was arrested later that same day, not after a dramatic chase, but near a public transit station. Video footage showed him walking slowly, almost detached, before complying immediately with police commands. No resistance, no attempt to flee. That image stood in stark contrast to the violence investigators were describing. It raised questions that could not yet be answered about state of mind, awareness, and the moments between the alleged act and the arrest. Friends and colleagues of Rob and Michelle struggled to reconcile what they were hearing with what they believed to be true. Many described the couple as exhausted but hopeful parents, people who had spent years trying to help a son who battled inner demons. There were stories of support, of treatment programs, of second chances. Stories that painted not a perfect family, but one deeply engaged in the struggle to keep itself intact. Each recollection added emotional weight to the tragedy, reinforcing how impossible the outcome seemed. What makes this case so unsettling is not only the accusation itself, but the collapse of a narrative people trusted. The idea that love, effort, and persistence might still fail so completely. The investigation was only beginning, and the legal process would take months, possibly years, to unfold. But already, the damage was irreversible. 2 lives lost, 1 family destroyed, and a haunting question left behind in the quiet rooms of a Brentwood house. where silence had replaced everything that once felt safe. Long before the headlines and the courtroom language, before the words suspect and charges entered the conversation, Nick Reiner existed inside a family shaped by extraordinary visibility. Being born into the household of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner meant growing up surrounded by success, creativity, and expectations that were never spoken aloud, yet always present. From the outside, it looked like privilege in its purest form. A beautiful home, access to opportunity, parents who were respected and admired. But inside that environment, the lines between protection and pressure, between love and identity, were far less clear. Nick was the middle child, wedged between an older brother and a younger sister, navigating his place in a family where the surname itself carried weight. From an early age, those close to the family noticed that he was restless, intense, emotionally volatile in ways that could not be easily explained as simple childhood behavior. Teachers, caregivers, and family friends later described a boy who struggled to regulate his emotions, who arrived at activities already burning with an energy that felt overwhelming. There were attempts to manage it, to guide it, to soften it, but nothing seemed to fully reach him. As Nick entered adolescence, that restlessness hardened into something darker. The search for identity became urgent and painful. In interviews years later, he would describe feeling undefined, invisible behind the towering figures of his father and even his grandfather. Fame, he said, had a way of swallowing individuality. For someone already unsure of who he was, it became easier to rebel than to belong. Drugs entered his life early, not as a social experiment, but as an escape. What began as use quickly became dependence, and dependence turned into a cycle that would repeat itself for years. His parents responded the only way they knew how. They sought help. They trusted professionals. They sent him to treatment programs again and again, believing that structure, therapy, and time would eventually stabilize him. At one point, Nick would later admit that he had been through rehabilitation more than a dozen times. There were stretches of sobriety, followed by relapses that were often more severe than before. He drifted in and out of stability, sometimes disappearing entirely from the family home, sometimes resurfacing with renewed promises and fragile hope. The years of addiction took him far from the world he had been born into. There were periods when Nick was homeless, sleeping on streets in different states, cut off not only from comfort, but from any sense of belonging. These were not moments his parents advertised or concealed with public relations. Those close to the family say they were periods of quiet panic and constant fear. Every unanswered call carried the possibility of catastrophe. Every knock on the door brought relief simply because it was not worse news. Despite everything, Rob and Michelle did not sever ties. Friends later described their approach as relentless love, sometimes to the point of exhaustion. They set boundaries when they believed they had to, withdrew financial support to avoid enabling destructive behavior, yet continued to offer emotional presence and access to treatment. It was a balancing act with no clear rules, and they often questioned whether they were doing the right thing. In rare public reflections, Rob would later suggest that he and Michelle may have relied too heavily on experts and not listened closely enough to their son's own voice during his darkest periods. One of the most significant turning points in their relationship came through an unlikely place: art. In the mid-2010s, Nick co-wrote a film inspired by his own struggles with addiction and his complicated bond with his father. The project, later directed by Rob himself, became more than a movie. It became a shared confrontation of pain that had long gone unspoken. Working together forced conversations that years of therapy had not fully unlocked. Rob described the process as a kind of family therapy, raw and uncomfortable but necessary. Nick, in turn, spoke of seeing his father not as an icon, but as a flawed man trying to reach him. For a time, it appeared to work. Nick entered another phase of recovery. Interviews from that period suggest a cautious optimism. He spoke about rebuilding trust, about learning who he was without substances about the possibility of a future not defined by chaos. His parents, though guarded, allowed themselves to believe that something had shifted. Friends recalled dinners that felt almost normal again, moments where laughter returned to the table without tension lurking underneath every exchange. But recovery is rarely linear. Even as years passed, uncertainty remained. Publicly, little was known about Nick's life after that film. Privately, concerns never fully disappeared. Addiction leaves scars that do not fade easily, and the fear of relapse hovered like a shadow no one could outrun. What looked like calm from the outside may have masked ongoing struggles that even those closest to him could not fully see. This context does not offer answers, nor does it soften the gravity of the accusations that would later emerge. But it does reveal a family history shaped not by neglect, but by prolonged struggle, hope, disappointment, and unresolved pain. It shows how a life can be surrounded by love and still feel unbearably isolated. And it raises the question that lingers beneath every detail of this case. At what point does a long battle quietly cross a line no one realizes has been passed? The days leading up to the deaths were outwardly unremarkable, which is often what makes such tragedies feel even more unsettling in retrospect. There was no public crisis, no emergency call, no visible sign that a breaking point was approaching. From the outside, life at the Brentwood house appeared calm, almost routine. Those who saw the family in the weeks before later described ordinary moments, shared meals, casual conversations, gestures that suggested stability rather than danger. It is within that quiet normalcy that the shock of what followed becomes almost unbearable. In the final 24 hours before the bodies were discovered, the family attended a holiday gathering hosted by Conan O'Brien. It was the kind of social event that blended familiarity and formality, a room full of people who had known each other for years, exchanging light conversation, laughter, and seasonal politeness. Yet even there, something seemed off. According to multiple reports later cited by entertainment and news outlets, Nick's presence stood out in ways that made others uncomfortable. He reportedly drifted between conversations, interrupting, asking intrusive questions, appearing disconnected from social cues. At one point, tension surfaced between him and his father. What was said remains unclear, and no official account has confirmed the substance of that exchange. But witnesses would later recall raised voices, visible frustration, and an atmosphere that shifted from casual to strained. Rob and Michelle left the gathering earlier than expected. To some, it seemed like nothing more than parental fatigue or the desire to avoid a scene. To others, in hindsight, it would take on a far heavier meaning. That night closed without incident, at least none that reached the outside world. No calls to police, no requests for help, just a house returning to silence. The following day unfolded slowly. Appointments were missed. A massage therapist reportedly attempted to contact the couple and received no response. Concern escalated from mild confusion to fear. When authorities were finally alerted and entered the home, the discovery confirmed the worst. Rob and Michelle were found dead, victims of a violent attack involving a knife. Investigators indicated that the wounds suggested a close and personal assault, not a random act. The brutality of the scene contrasted sharply with the reputation of the home itself, a place long associated with warmth, creativity, and family. As news of the death spread, attention turned immediately to Nick, not because of rumor alone, but because of emerging evidence that placed him near the scene and raised urgent questions about his movements. Law enforcement located him later that day near a public transit station, several miles from the family residence. Surveillance footage captured him entering a gas station shortly before the arrest, moving slowly, his posture heavy, his expression distant. When officers approached, he did not run. He did not argue. He raised his hands and complied fully, as if resistance no longer held meaning. That moment, recorded and replayed across media platforms, became one of the most haunting images of the case. Viewers searched his face for clues, for remorse, confusion, or emptiness. Experts cautioned against drawing conclusions from demeanor alone, reminding audiences that shock, dissociation, and mental health factors can produce reactions that defy expectation. Still, the image lingered, a visual counterpoint to the violence investigators were describing. Inside the investigation, authorities began reconstructing a narrow and complex timeline. They examined security footage from neighboring homes, analyzed phone location data, and scrutinized physical evidence within the house. Reports suggested that the attack may have occurred hours before the bodies were found, possibly during the night following the party. Medical examiners worked to estimate time of death, knowing that such determinations are never exact and often complicated by environmental factors. Each hour mattered, not only for establishing sequence, but for understanding intent and opportunity. The absence of an officially stated motive fueled speculation. Some media outlets pointed to Nick's history of substance abuse and prior instability. Others focused on the alleged argument at the party, framing it as a possible trigger. Investigators, however, remained cautious. No motive was announced. No toxicology results were released. Law enforcement emphasized that the case was still unfolding and that premature conclusions could jeopardize both accuracy and justice. Family friends who spoke anonymously described growing concern in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. They claimed Rob and Michelle were worried about Nick's mental state, sensing a deterioration they did not fully understand. At the same time, those same sources insisted the parents had not withdrawn support. According to these accounts, Nick had been staying on the property in a guest house, maintaining daily contact with his parents, sharing meals, participating in family routines. If true, it painted a picture not of estrangement, but of proximity, closeness that may have amplified underlying tension rather than easing it. The emotional weight of the case deepened when it became clear who discovered the bodies. Their daughter, Romy, was the one who ultimately encountered the scene after concerns were raised. That detail alone reframed the tragedy, expanding it beyond the accused and the victims to include a sibling forced into a moment no one should ever experience. The trauma of that discovery, though not central to the charges, became an unspoken presence in every discussion of the case. As coverage intensified, legal analysts such as Jesse Weber emphasized restraint. They reminded audiences that charges are not convictions, that evidence must be tested in court, and that even the most disturbing allegations require careful examination. The language of the justice system moved forward deliberately, while public emotion surged ahead, hungry for answers that did not yet exist. What remains most disturbing about this phase of the story is not a single act or moment, but the convergence of unresolved struggles, proximity, and silence. A family that had survived years of addiction, relapse, and reconciliation now stood at the center of an accusation that defied everything they had fought for. The investigation would continue, evidence would surface, and the legal process would unfold step by step. But in this space between the last normal evening and the first court appearance, the story hardened into something irreversible, a turning point after which nothing could ever return to what it was. The impact of the accusations did not stop at the crime scene. Once the initial shock settled, the consequences began to spread outward, touching every layer of the lives connected to Rob and Michelle Reiner. What had started as a private family tragedy quickly became a public reckoning, one that unfolded under relentless scrutiny. For those closest to the family, grief was immediately compounded by exposure. There was no space to mourn quietly. Every memory, every past interview, every photograph was suddenly re-examined through the lens of suspicion and loss. For the entertainment community, the deaths marked more than the loss of two individuals. Rob Reiner had been a constant presence for decades, not just as a filmmaker, but as a collaborator, mentor, and friend. Colleagues struggled to reconcile the warmth they knew with the violent circumstances now attached to his name. Tributes poured in, filled with disbelief and sorrow, yet often cautious in tone, reflecting an unspoken awareness that the story was still unfolding and deeply unresolved. Michelle Singer Reiner, though less visible to the public, was remembered by those in her professional circle as a steady, decisive force, someone who balanced creative vision with discipline and care. Her absence left a quieter but equally profound void. Within the family, the consequences were devastating and immediate. The surviving children were forced into an impossible position, grieving their parents while watching their brother become the central figure in a homicide investigation. The emotional strain of holding both realities at once cannot be overstated. Family dynamics that had already been fragile were now shattered beyond recognition. Every future memory would be permanently divided into before and after. The home in Brentwood, once a symbol of refuge, was transformed into a place of trauma, sealed off by police tape and memories no one could erase. The legal ramifications also began to take shape quickly. Nick Reiner faced the prospect of life imprisonment or even capital punishment, depending on how prosecutors pursued the case and how the evidence unfolded. His initial court appearance was delayed due to medical and procedural reasons, a detail that only heightened public curiosity and speculation. Legal experts emphasize that such delays are not unusual in cases involving mental health evaluations and complex forensic analysis. Still, for the public, each postponement felt like another unanswered question. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement agencies worked methodically, reconstructing the events leading up to the deaths. Every communication, every movement, every interaction was scrutinized. This process, while necessary, inevitably prolonged the suffering of those involved. Each new report, no matter how small, reopened wounds. The lack of an officially stated motive continued to loom large, leaving room for narratives driven more by fear than fact. Media coverage intensified the emotional fallout. Headlines oscillated between restraint and sensationalism, reflecting the tension inherent in reporting on a case that involved fame, family, and extreme violence. Some outlets focused on Nick's history of addiction and instability, framing it as a cautionary tale. Others emphasized the parents' long struggle to support him, casting the tragedy as a heartbreaking failure of love to overcome illness. Both approaches risked oversimplification. Addiction, mental health, and family relationships do not follow linear scripts, and reducing the case to a single explanation did little to honor its complexity. Public reaction mirrored this divide. Sympathy flowed toward the victims and their legacy, but it was often accompanied by uncomfortable questions about responsibility, boundaries, and whether warning signs had been missed. At the same time, there were calls for restraint, reminders that accusations are not convictions, and pleas to allow the legal process to unfold without interference. The case became a mirror reflecting society's conflicting attitudes toward mental illness, crime, and accountability. Perhaps the most enduring consequence of this phase was the erosion of certainty. The belief that dedication, resources, and unwavering support can always prevent catastrophe was shaken. Rob and Michelle Reiner were widely viewed as parents who tried everything. Their story challenged the comforting notion that effort guarantees safety, revealing instead how fragile even the strongest bonds can be under sustained strain. As weeks turned into months, the immediate shock gave way to a heavy, lingering sorrow. The investigation continued behind closed doors, while those left behind grappled with a reality that no legal outcome could truly resolve. The deaths had already rewritten the family's history and altered the way the public would remember them. What remained was a collective pause, a recognition that the full cost of this tragedy extended far beyond the courtroom, into lives permanently changed by loss, uncertainty, and unanswered questions. Behind the headlines and legal filings, there were quieter stories that never made it into official statements. These were not moments captured by cameras or preserved in transcripts, but fragments remembered by people who had watched the family navigate years of uncertainty. Friends spoke of small, almost invisible gestures that revealed how much effort had gone into holding things together. A late-night phone call answered without hesitation. a door left unlocked in case someone needed to come home unexpectedly, a meal prepared even when no one was sure who would sit at the table. Those close to Rob Reiner often described him as someone who carried worry silently. He was known publicly for confidence and humor, but privately he was said to be constantly calculating, constantly asking himself whether he had done enough, whether he had chosen the right approach at the right moment. He rarely spoke in absolutes when it came to his son. Instead, he framed the struggle as ongoing, something that required patience rather than solutions. There were times, according to acquaintances, when he appeared hopeful, almost relieved, believing that a turning point had finally arrived. Those moments were fragile and easily undone. Michelle Singer Reiner, in contrast, was remembered as the organizer of emotional survival. Friends often described her as the one who kept schedules, who coordinated treatment options, who maintained contact with doctors and counselors. She was practical in a way that felt grounding to those around her. When hope rose too quickly, she tempered it with caution. When despair crept in, she pushed forward anyway. People who knew her say she rarely allowed herself the luxury of denial. If something was wrong, she wanted to confront it directly, even if the confrontation hurt. There were periods when Nick seemed almost at peace. During those times, he reportedly participated in family routines again, helping with chores, sharing meals, watching television with his parents in the evenings. These moments mattered more than outsiders could understand. They represented normalcy, however brief. Friends recall Rob speaking about those stretches with a guarded optimism, as if afraid to name the hope too loudly in case it disappeared. The family learned to celebrate progress quietly, without announcements or expectations. Yet beneath those calmer surfaces, tension often remained. Addiction does not vanish simply because behavior improves, and those who live alongside it rarely relax completely. People familiar with the household described an atmosphere of constant alertness. Every change in mood was noticed. Every shift in routine prompted concern. The family existed in a state of emotional readiness, prepared to respond at any moment if things began to slide again. That vigilance, over time, took a toll of its own. Some friends recalled conversations where Rob questioned his own instincts. He wondered whether love could become pressure, whether boundaries could feel like rejection. He worried that his public identity had complicated his private role as a father, making it harder for his son to feel separate and self-defined. These doubts were not shared widely, but when they surfaced, they carried the weight of years spent trying to balance responsibility with compassion. There was no script for this kind of parenting, no clear measure of success. Michelle's private reflections, as remembered by those who spoke with her, were often more restrained but equally heavy. She expressed frustration not with her son, but with the limits of control. She understood that no amount of planning could guarantee safety. That understanding did not make the fear easier to bear. It only made it more honest. She was said to believe deeply in accountability, but also in the idea that people are more than their worst moments. Holding both beliefs at once required emotional strength that few recognized from the outside. Even Nick, in periods when he spoke openly about his past, acknowledged the contradiction of his upbringing. He described feeling loved yet lost, supported yet unsure of who he was meant to be. Fame, he said, distorted mirrors. It reflected expectations instead of identity. Those words, spoken years before the tragedy, would later echo with painful resonance. They suggested a struggle that had never fully resolved, only shifted shape over time. These unspoken stories do not explain what happened, nor do they assign blame. They exist in the margins of a larger narrative, reminding us that lives are not defined solely by their endings. The family's history was filled with effort, care, and persistence that rarely made headlines. It was built on repeated attempts to move forward despite setbacks that would have overwhelmed many others. That context does not change the facts under investigation, but it deepens the human dimension of the loss. What makes these quieter moments so haunting is their ordinariness. There was no single dramatic warning, no unmistakable sign that catastrophe was imminent. Instead, there were years of trying, adjusting, hoping, and fearing, all woven into daily life. In the end, those small, unseen acts of love became part of the tragedy itself, evidence of how much was invested and how much was lost. When the noise of speculation begins to fade, what remains is a question far quieter and far more difficult to answer. What does a story like this leave behind once the legal process moves forward and the headlines eventually move on? The lives of Rob and Michelle Reiner cannot be reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. Yet those circumstances now stand beside everything they built. Their legacy exists in tension, balance between what they created and what they endured. Rob Reiner's public life was defined by stories that believed in human connection even when people failed each other. His films returned again and again to the idea that flawed individuals could still choose kindness, that misunderstandings could be bridged, that love often survived disappointment. That worldview did not come from fantasy. It was shaped by decades of observing people closely, including those closest to him. In that sense, his work now feels almost painfully intimate. The themes he explored on screen mirrored the values he tried to live by at home: commitment, forgiveness, the refusal to give up on those you love, even when the path forward is unclear. Michelle Singer Reiner's legacy is harder to summarize because she never sought definition through public recognition. Her impact was felt in structure, in steadiness, in the countless decisions that rarely draw attention but keep families functioning. She represented the quiet labor of care, the kind that does not appear in credits or applause. Those who knew her describe a woman who believed that responsibility was not optional, even when it became exhausting. She carried the weight of problem-solving without spectacle, trusting that consistency mattered more than praise. Together, they embodied a version of parenthood that was neither idealized nor abandoned. They did not disappear from their child's struggle, nor did they pretend it was simple. Their story challenges a comforting narrative many people rely on: the belief that love and effort are always enough. It suggests instead that love can be deep and sincere and still fall short of preventing disaster. That realization is unsettling because it removes the illusion of control. It forces an acknowledgement of limits, even in families that appear to have every advantage. The tragedy also leaves behind questions about how society understands addiction and mental illness. For years, Nick's struggles were framed publicly as a battle he was fighting, sometimes winning, sometimes losing. His parents' efforts were seen as examples of support and perseverance. Yet the outcome, as it stands under investigation, forces a confrontation with the reality that recovery is not a finish line. It is fragile. It requires not only resources, but timing, stability, and an internal readiness that cannot be imposed from the outside. The Reiner family's experience exposes how easily progress can unravel and how devastating the consequences can be when it does. In reflecting on this story, it becomes clear that legacy is not always about resolution. Sometimes it is about contradiction. Rob Reiner will continue to be remembered for films that made people laugh, cry, and believe in connection. Michelle will be remembered by those who knew her as the anchor that held a complex life together. At the same time, their names are now tied to a case that defies the narratives they live by. Both truths exist simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. There's also a quieter legacy that emerges in the conversations this case has sparked. Parents who have watched their own children struggle have seen themselves reflected in the Reiner story. Professionals in mental health and addiction treatment have pointed to it as evidence of how much remains unknown, how often warning signs are ambiguous, how rarely there is a clear moment when intervention guarantees safety. The story has become a point of reflection, not because it offers answers, but because it exposes the depth of uncertainty that surrounds human behavior. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is not about failure, but about vulnerability. The Reiner family's experience strips away the illusion that status or success can insulate anyone from tragedy. It reveals how private pain can coexist with public accomplishment and how love can persist even when outcomes are devastating. In that sense, their story becomes less about notoriety and more about the shared fragility of families everywhere. What remains unresolved is not only the legal outcome, but the emotional reckoning that follows such loss. No verdict can restore what was taken. No explanation can fully satisfy the need to understand. The legacy left behind is one of complexity, reminding us that lives cannot be summarized by a single chapter, no matter how dark. They are made of years, choices, efforts, and intentions that continue to matter, even when the ending feels impossible to accept. As this story reaches its quietest point, there's no sense of closure waiting at the end. Only a pause, a moment where the weight of everything that has happened settles in, heavy and unresolved. The deaths of Rob and Michelle Reiner cannot be neatly contained within legal documents or summarized by verdicts yet to come. They exist now as an absence that reshaped an entire family, a void that words struggle to fill. What remains most striking is not only the violence of the accusations, but the contrast between what this family represented and how their story has unfolded. For years, Rob and Michelle were seen as parents who did not turn away from difficulty. They stayed present. They stayed engaged. They continued to hope, even when hope came at a cost. That commitment did not shield them from tragedy, and that truth is perhaps the hardest to accept. It confronts a belief many hold quietly, that doing everything right should somehow guarantee safety in the end. For the public, the case has been both disturbing and reflective. It has forced viewers to sit with discomfort rather than resolution. There is no simple villain, no clear moral that offers reassurance. Instead, there's a collision of love, illness, fear, and consequences that unfolded over many years before reaching a moment no one could undo. The temptation to reduce it to a single cause remains strong, but doing so strips the story of its human complexity. For the surviving family members, the road forward is unimaginably difficult. Grief does not arrive in a single wave and then recede. It returns in fragments, triggered by memories, questions, and the permanence of what has been lost. They are left to carry the weight of mourning parents while navigating the reality that their brother stands accused of causing that loss. There are no words that make such a burden lighter. Only time, and even then, only partially. The legal process will continue. Evidence will be examined. Arguments will be made. Decisions will eventually be rendered. But the outcome of the case, whatever it may be, cannot repair the damage already done. Justice, in its formal sense, does not restore relationships or erase trauma. It can only address responsibility within the boundaries of the law. Everything beyond that remains deeply personal and painfully unresolved. Perhaps the lasting impact of this story lies in the way it forces a collective reckoning. It asks uncomfortable questions about how society understands addiction and mental health, about how families navigate long-term struggle, and about how easily progress can be mistaken for permanence. It challenges the idea that love alone is a safeguard, revealing instead how fragile even the strongest bonds can become under sustained strain. There is also a quieter takeaway, one that emerges only when the noise fades. The recognition that behind every headline are years of private effort that will never be fully known. That behind every accusation is a history that cannot be undone, only acknowledged. Rob and Michelle Reiner lived lives defined by creation, care, and persistence. Those truths do not disappear because of how their story ended. They exist alongside the tragedy, not erased by it. As viewers, we are left not with answers, but with responsibility. Responsibility to resist simplification. Responsibility to remember that real people lived inside this story, not characters written for resolution. And responsibility to hold space for uncertainty, even when it is uncomfortable. This is not a story that invites easy judgment. It is one that asks for reflection, patience, and humility. It reminds us that some losses cannot be explained in ways that bring peace, and that some questions remain open long after the last words are spoken. If you have followed this story to this point, the conversation does not end here. What stays with you from it may say as much about our shared fears and hopes as it does about the people at its center. Let me know if you want to revisit any part, expand further, or explore a different angle.